Thank you, worship team, for leading us this morning on Resurrection Sunday. Because if you haven't noticed, today is Resurrection Sunday, which we are celebrating. And as we think about the Gospels, there are through the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there are lots of different stories that are all part of the whole story of the resurrection. And one of those stories is the story of doubt. And it feels strange to be thinking about doubt this morning because we are people of faith. We are people of faith who believe that Jesus has died and that he has conquered death. That he has died and that he has come back, that he has been resurrected. That is our strong faith. But doubt and faith are not opposites. Doubt and faith are best understood as companions. Because where there is faith, at times doubt may present itself. In fact, it's probably better to understand that the opposite of faith is certainty. Because where there is certainty, there's no room for doubt. Where there's no room for faith. I'm sorry, I'm getting these things up. Where there is certainty, there's no room for faith. We are people of faith, and at times we may experience doubt. So this morning, we want to invite Annika to come up and read for us the story of, as you guessed, doubting Thomas in John chapter 20.
Good morning. Jesus appears to Thomas. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and I put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed."
Thank you, Annika. The word of the Lord. Well, Thomas. This is not our first introduction to Thomas. We know him, however, most likely as Doubting Thomas. But to be fair to Thomas, particularly in the Gospel of John, we meet him two other times. Earlier, we understand the first introduction to Thomas should be understood as we should understand Thomas as Thomas the Brave. Earlier in the Gospel of John, Jesus and the disciples, they are in Jerusalem, and they leave Jerusalem, they cross back onto the other side of the Jordan, and Jesus learns about Lazarus. He learns that Lazarus has died, and so Jesus says, we need to go back to Judea. We need to go back towards Jerusalem, and all the disciples say, "No, you can't do that, Jesus. You can't go back. The people want to kill you there." And what does Thomas say? Thomas says, I will go and die with Jesus. Thomas the Brave. And then in the night before Jesus died, as Jesus is in the upper room teaching the disciples, in John chapter 14, Jesus is talking about the place where he is going to go. He has gone to prepare a place for us, and he's going to go ahead of them. And Thomas is like that guy or girl or student in the classroom. You remember back when you were a student and the teacher said there's no such thing as a dumb question? And nobody understands what the teacher is. And so the teacher's teaching, nobody understands what the teacher is talking about, but nobody wants to be the person to ask the question. Well, Thomas is the one who asks the question. And when that person asks the question, everybody else says, "Thank you for asking the question." Thomas says, "Jesus, we don't know where you're going. We don't know the way." And all the disciples say, "Thank you, Thomas, for asking." In which Jesus' response to Thomas's question elicits this great response. Maybe the greatest declaration of Jesus himself, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," he says. So Thomas the Brave is now Thomas the Honest. But here we know him. He is best known as Thomas the Doubter, or the Doubting Thomas. And the first thing we learn in this passage is that the disciples had been together and Jesus had presented himself and had come to them in the upper room where they were gathered in fear. and Thomas wasn't there. We don't know why Thomas wasn't there. Perhaps, unlike the other disciples who were gathered in fear, wondering what was going to happen to them, he was just ready to move on. He had gone maybe back to where he had come from. He had picked up whatever job he used to do, and he was just going to resume life. We don't know. We don't really know why Thomas wasn't there. But what we can imagine, as it says in our 30-minute Bible, is that it must have been a long week for Thomas. Because from the day that he learned that Jesus had appeared to the disciples, it was a week before Jesus appeared to Thomas. And it must have been a long week for him. And you can imagine, what was that week like for Thomas? Was he anxious? Was he kind of wondering and worried about everything, what he had missed? Was he feeling stuck? Was he confused? Or had he just kind of carried on? And what was it like for the disciples? What was it like for the disciples to have one of their own, whom they had traveled with for 3 years and had grown together as a community, miss out on this and be doubting the resurrection when they were all so certain because they had seen Jesus? What was it like to have a doubter in the crowd? Were they judging him? Were they condemning him? Were they talking behind his back? Or were they coming alongside him gently and encouraging him? Were they praying for him? Were they saying, just wait, hold out hope. You'll see him. He's going to come back. You're going to see him again. Just hold on, Thomas. Hold on. Of course, we don't know. But we can imagine for that week, from the day that Jesus appeared to the disciples to the day that he appeared again to them with Thomas in their midst, Thomas's doubt was a central feature to that week. Thomas was thinking about it. I would imagine the disciples were thinking about it. And if we look at ourselves, we might wonder, what does doubt look like in our lives? Do we struggle with doubt? Do we experience doubt? Perhaps you're here this morning and you doubt the whole story. You doubt the resurrection itself. It is just not possible. It does not make sense. A person cannot come back for life. Dead is dead. Resurrection doesn't happen. And of course, as Christians, this is central to our faith. This is, the Apostle Paul says, without the resurrection, our faith is useless. So we proclaim the resurrection, but some of us might be here wondering, it's all nonsense. It's ridiculous. Can this really happen? People don't come back from the dead. Or perhaps you're convinced of the resurrection. You believe in the resurrection. You've sort of read some of the books that talk about the evidence of the resurrection. The fact that these disciples had gone on and had proclaimed the truth of the resurrection. Their lives had been transformed. And that itself is evidence. How could people put their lives on the line for a lie? People don't do that. People don't sacrifice their lives for a lie, do they? Maybe that's enough evidence for you. Or perhaps you're like me. I mean, this is sort of how I understand it, is that I accept that God is the creator of the universe, and if God could create the universe from nothing, if God could speak out of darkness and bring forth this world and the universe and the galaxies and all the beauty, if he could bring forth life, including our life, God can bring life back from the dead. God is God. God can do what he wants. So we may all be coming at this from different vantage points in terms of what doubt looks like in our lives. But I wonder if for some of us, doubt is not these existential questions. Is it really possible that someone could come back from life? But I wonder if doubt is just showing up in our life, saying we believe in the resurrection, but we live as if the resurrection just doesn't matter. It's irrelevant to our life day to day. Craig Groeschel is a pastor from the States, and he talks about atheism and practical atheism, the term you may have heard, and then he adds to that what he calls Christian atheism. Atheism, of course, we would understand is simply the disbelief in the existence of God, the refusal to believe in the existence of anything beyond the material world, anything that we could see. That is an atheist. We understand what an atheist is. A practical atheist understands or has some belief in God that sort of is apathetic towards that belief, like it doesn't matter. And then, Groucho's probably splitting hairs here a little bit, but he adds to that something that he calls the Christian atheist. And the Christian atheist is the person who believes in Christ, but in their practical day in and day out life, as they get further and further away from the celebration of Easter Sunday, just live their lives as if Easter doesn't matter. The resurrection makes no difference in lives or in our life. Groucho asks a bunch of questions as a sort of a self-assessment to peg ourselves, like, are we living like Christian atheists or not? And he has a whole list of them. I just wanted to sort of maybe just explore some of them. 3 of them, maybe we can explore to sort of examine our life as Christians, as followers of Jesus who believe in the resurrection and have committed ourselves to God. Are we living that out in our life? We know, for example, that God calls us to surrender. But do we resist the whole idea of surrender? Are there things in our lives that we don't want to surrender to God? We want to keep control of these things. Our finances, for example. Perhaps we want to say, we'll give 10% to God, but the rest is mine. I'm going to control it. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to trust God with my finances. I want to use this money the way I want to use it. I'm not going to have conversations with God about what do I do with this. Should I buy that toy or that new thing? Should I invest over there? I'm just going to trust myself on this one. So we refuse to surrender. Or perhaps it's not our finances, but it is just a habit that we have, or even an addiction. Alcohol, pornography, these different things that we struggle with in our lives. We'll give everything to God, but I don't want to give this over. I want to hold on to this one. I'm not going to trust God with this area of my life. We refuse to surrender. What about forgiveness? Forgiveness is a hard thing. We know that God calls us not just to surrender our lives to Him, but to forgive those who have hurt us. Forgiveness is hard. The deeper the wound, the more difficult it is to forgive. It's a process. It takes time, of course. It's not just something that anyone, including God, would just expect you to be able to do easily. But are we even willing to engage God in prayer about that? Ask God for the strength to go through the process of forgiveness. Because we understand that God, when He talks to us about forgiveness, wants to make us whole. He wants us to experience resurrection in our life through forgiveness, because when we can forgive those who have hurt us, we experience wholeness and life ourselves. But we refuse to surrender that to God. We refuse to entertain that idea because we want to hang on to the grudge. We want to hang on to the anger. We're living as Christian atheists in that way. It's like we don't believe in the power of the resurrection when we refuse to entertain the idea of forgiveness and enter into conversation with God about forgiveness. And what about the call to live in church community? God has called us to be a community together, but we don't want to give up our own individualism. We don't want to do and practice the norms of community. We don't want to be accountable to others who we're a part of a faith community together with. We want to live our own lives. We want to keep our own things to ourselves. But yet God calls the resurrected community to be a church. God empowers them with the Holy Spirit and forms the church. This is God's idea for the people of the resurrection, is that they would be community together and care for one another, love one another, and go on mission together. But sometimes that feels like it's asking too much of ourselves, and so we don't want to fully do that. And when we do, it's like we're denying the power of the resurrection, we're denying the reality of the resurrection in our lives. So how we respond to these different things, or maybe there's some other areas of your life that you're wondering, maybe that's an example of me not fully embracing the power of the resurrection in life. Speaks about what we really believe about the power of the resurrection. We believe Jesus died. We believe that He is risen again. We can accept that. But do we struggle with the reality of that in our daily lives? We left the story of Thomas that we read with this question of wondering, what was that week like for Thomas? Well, verse 26, we see that the disciples are gathered again, back in the upper room. A week later, and through the doors, Jesus enters. Maybe not even through the doors. Oh, no, listen, though the doors, not through the doors. Though the doors were locked. Though the doors were locked. It's like I'm denying the mystery of the resurrection. Jesus took the door. No, he didn't take the door. This wonderful resurrected Jesus entered through the walls. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came to them and extended to the disciples peace. The same peace that he extended to the disciples earlier on, that Thomas had missed out on. Now Thomas experiences the peace of Jesus. But then Jesus, knowing the doubts of Thomas, without missing a beat, directly turns to Thomas himself. And he says to him, "Put your fingers here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Just start believing. Stop this doubting. Here I am. This is what you were asking for. This is what you can have. And Thomas doesn't even need, we don't know whether he actually reached out and touched him. It doesn't say that he did. It's like the evidence of him there, speaking to them, offering his peace was enough. And Thomas makes this great declaration to Jesus in front of the disciples, "My Lord and my God, my King, you are the ruler of my life. I give my life to you. I believe in you as the resurrection. I surrender everything to you. You are my Lord, my God." This is Thomas's response to the resurrected Jesus. I love the fact that we know through church tradition that this was a transformative experience for Thomas. I grew up in my church with a family, friends of ours, good friends of my parents, and their kids became good friends of me and my brother. And they were from India. They were from a little province called Kerala, India. And they hold, do you want to go to that slide there with the map? Yeah, so if you can imagine down in the bottom corner of India along I guess it would be the west coast, is the province of Kerala. And church tradition says that Thomas went to the south coast of India and established the church there. He evangelized that community. So these friends of mine take their tradition of faith all the way back to the Apostle Thomas. I love that. I love that they can say our community came to Christ because of the transformation of Thomas, who came to us as an evangelist. Thomas was transformed by this experience and went on in faith, proclaiming the gospel, traveling even as far as India. And then we see in verse 29 that Jesus affirms the faith of Thomas. He recognizes it. He says, "Because you have seen me, you have believed." But then this last line, the last line of the story that we read, these words from Jesus, these are words for us. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Those are your words. Those are my words. These are words for us. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. We have confidence in the resurrection. We can be people who have confidence in the reality of the resurrection. And I'd like us just to maybe spend the last few minutes here exploring, what does that mean for us? What does it mean in our lives to demonstrate confidence in the resurrection? 3 ideas to think about. The first is, people who have confidence in the resurrection don't despair about the future. They don't give in to despair about the future. Last week I mentioned Pastor Mike Glenn. Mike Glenn is a pastor of a large church in Nashville. Nashville, of course, is the site of the school shooting, the most recent school shooting. Mike Glenn talks about a week in his recent blog. He talks about a week of 6 funerals, day after day, a different funeral. And he says, how do you not give in to despair when you have that sort of a week? The sin of despair he talks about. It's so easy to doubt that God can do anything about this. It's so easy to imagine when you see that much evil in the world, 6 funerals, to believe that God could do anything about it. See, doubt even can come to the pastor of a Virgin Island church, whatever. Doubt comes to any of us, right? It doesn't matter who you are. We can start asking these questions when we see this kind of evil in the world. I shared on a Facebook post this morning. I love these. I was quoting from Steve Bell, who has a little devotional about Easter. I just want to read the words to you. Steve Bell saying, "Admittedly, attempting to say anything about the future is like erecting a signpost pointing into a fog." That's not a great image. That's actually, he's quoting N.T. right there when he says that. Saying anything about the future is like erecting a signpost. That's pointing directly into the fog. However, in Jesus, God's future comes to us out of the fog, and we catch a glimmer of the glory that God has intended for creation all along. We catch this glimmer of the future reality that we have in faith, where there is going to be a world free of pain and suffering. And that is the picture that Jesus gave to us in life. What Steve Bell says in his, the next kind of paragraph down, he says, "So what I encourage you to do, and this would be a great exercise for any of us, is to go from here this week and just read through the Gospels and look at these pictures of new life that Jesus is bringing, the stories of new life that Jesus is bringing, and imagine that that is what Jesus is pointing us towards. That is the hope that we have in the future. We do not need to despair because Jesus is pointing us towards a new hope and a new life. Through his death and his resurrection, he has brought about a new creation. We one day will experience the fullness of that upon Jesus' return. But we can see tastes of it, we can see sparks of it in life even now. I was reading a book recently called, what's it called? Go to the next slide for me. It's called The Beekeepers. This is a picture of the author celebrating. I was, a funny story about this book. I picked it up at the library, and I was at Simon's volleyball games at the high school last week, and one of his friends said to him, because I was there watching the volleyball game, but I also had a book. I wasn't reading during his games, but there was sort of like, he'd play a game, and then there'd be another game, and he wouldn't be playing, so I sat down and I'd read my book. And one of his friends said to him, "Your dad looks so smart." So one person that had a book. So I said to Simon, "Well, did you tell your friend that I got this book out of the children's section?" It's a great 4-level book, but it's a fabulous book about bumblebees. Some of you know that I'm a beekeeper. I keep honeybees. So I was interested in learning about, not about the European honeybees, but about the native bees, the bumblebees. And so this book talks about all sorts of actions. It's actually a very tragic book. It's talking about the demise of the bumblebees, the native bees, because of European bumblebees and honeybees that have been brought in and contributing to the demise, and other things, chemicals and pesticides, etc. All the things that you can imagine. So you're reading through this book. It's interesting, it's fascinating, it's tragic. But she ends it with, I think because she's realizing that kids are reading her book, she needs to end with the word of hope. And so in the last chapter of the book, she talks about the hope that we have. And I love that. I love that she does not end with the bad news story. There is still some good news to come. There are still some things that we can do to save the bumblebees. I mentioned Catherine Hayhoe last week, I think it was. Catherine Hayhoe is a Christian. She's a climate change scientist, also a person of faith. In her weekly blogs, she always tells a good news story, and then she tells a bad news story. Both of them are the truth. The good news story, the bad news story, and then she ends with some words of inspiration. So again, when we talk about being people who aren't to give into despair, it's easy to get caught up in the bad news cycles. Perhaps we just need to be wary of what we read, and we need to find people like Catherine Hayhoe who'd like to leave us with some inspiration and tell us good news stories as well. Because there is hope, because we are people of hope. People who demonstrate confidence in the resurrection do not give in to despair. People who demonstrate confidence in the resurrection also pray trusting that someone is listening to them. Many, many years ago when I was a Bible college student, I remember having a guest speaker Did I emphasize many too many times there? Many years ago, when I was a Bible college student, we had a guest speaker come in. His name was Keith Price, and he came in to talk about prayer. And I remember it so vividly because he spoke about prayer as if he was in his own personal prayer life. He would describe his personal prayer life as if he actually believed that the person who he was talking to, the being that he was talking to, was actually listening. People of the resurrection prayed to God and believed that God is present and listening. Imagine even that God is listening. Behave as if God is listening. It should transform our prayer life if we could believe and understand and act as if God is listening to us as we pray. And if we are caught up in these cycles of despair, we should take the words of Philippians 4, chapter 4, verse 6, very familiar verse to us. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Take even your anxious thoughts and bring them to God. Use the practice of breath prayer with this verse. Do not be anxious about anything. Say those words to yourself as you breathe. Do not be anxious about anything. Bring your requests to God. Do not make that a prayer of your life when you're feeling anxious. Breath prayer says you pray in one sentence and you exhale on the other. Do not be anxious about anything. Bring your requests to God, because God is alive. God hears you. God is listening to your prayer. And finally, we demonstrate confidence in the resurrection when we practice the upside-down ways of Jesus. Jesus in the Gospels showed us what it means to be a follower of Him and how to live in the ways of the new kingdom. The best summary of that, the best place that is captured is in the Beatitudes. The first of the Beatitudes says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the humble." What about just even practicing humility in our lives, understanding that humility is perhaps the starting point of following the ways of Jesus, living in His upside-down ways. Humility can be being happy for those. What does humility look like? We sort of all go all sorts of directions, but I just want to say one case would be humility is being happy for those who you might otherwise envy, or for those who it might be really easy to envy them, and choosing to be happy for them. I was in a conversation recently with someone where they were talking about this problem, but it was one of those problems that would be nice to have. This wasn't his example, but I got so much money, I just don't know how to spend it. That was what he was saying. But one of those problems that would be nice to have. This person was talking about this problem, and it would have been easy for me to be envious, saying, "I wish I had that problem in my life." But I had to tell myself, no, I'm going to choose to be happy for this person, because this is a good news problem that this person is dealing with. And that takes an act of humility. We need to choose humility. We need to sometimes choose to be happy for those who we might easily be tempted to be envious of. And finally, I just want to close by saying we demonstrate confidence in the resurrection by celebrating it together, by declaring the resurrection together. And we do that as we practice communion. So I love that we as a church every week declare our confidence in the resurrection when we take communion together. So I'm going to invite Guy to come up and lead us in communion now.